There we go.
All right.
How have you been?
Hey, good to see you, friend.
It's good to see you too. It's been a long time.
Been a little while, definitely.
Yeah. I was just reviewing the notes from our last conversation, and it was a very good conversation. And there's actually a lot of things that that I think, there is a lot of overlap, justification systems. Yeah. So I just saw the email that you sent a couple of minutes ago. So I'll let, last time I got to ask tons of questions about you personally, which is my usual mode, but we don't have to do that now. So why don't you jump in?
Sure. Well, there are a couple of things on my agenda. First off, it's good to see you. I've listened to several of your always illuminating conversations. I'm just coming off of the one you had with John on classic theism, common theism, non-theism, and it's beautiful, so
that was such a remarkable conversation. And conversations are sort of like dances. They're not up to either side, and so when it really goes well, it's quite a remarkable thing.
So as I take my walk these last 2 days, that's and it was the walk would go flying by. It was beautiful. So there's a lot there that I would perhaps like us to circle in. I also listened to some of the commentary that you offered in different contexts on the whole Vervaeke Jordan Peterson conversation. If that's a little dated now, but I wouldn't mind just at least picking your brain about anything that's alive for you in that context. And just to get your kind of take about what's happening and what have you been thinking about lately? And I can certainly share what's been going on in my crazy world. So
we'll start picking away, and I'm sure it'll start to flow.
So maybe you could offer. I'm really glad to hear you experience that as a dance. That was certainly my experience as a. Would you be willing to then offer some summary for folks that are, and I could certainly do that for my little audience or whatever, but let's maybe talk a little bit about the summary of the exchange you had with John.
Well, so I re-listened to a conversation that John had with Rafe Kelly.
Mm-hmm.
And Rafe has been interesting in this conversation because he has in some ways talked about his interest in Christianity while remaining skeptical about, I'd say, his profession of ontology with respect to God.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of people in that camp downstream from Jordan Peterson.
Mm-hmm.
I think part of what Peterson did was demonstrate the functional utility of the conceptualization of God.
Yep.
Now, so then when John Vervaeke comes in with his non-theism, it with all of these conversations, it even though we're just sitting here talking and we're nodding and we think we know what we're saying, we're talking about things that take a while to sort of sink in.
Amen to that.
And understand. And so I right away with Peterson, I began to notice, kind of the tensions about conceptualization of God and sort of the vernacular talk about God. I believe in God. I believe God exists, yada, yada, yada. Then with the Peterson, Sam Harris conversation, that's where it dawned on me that Sam Harris and Jordan Peterson were talking about two very different things.
Yep.
And that's when I coined the God number one and God number two. Yeah. So then I spent really a couple of years trying to figure out, and I intentionally kept it vague with number one and number two because I wanted those boxes loose.
Yep.
I didn't want, so once you start calling it, a bunch of the things that I did, general versus special revelation, implicit versus explicit, or, transcendent versus immanent.
Yep.
And then eventually the one of the best schemas that began working for me was John's agent arena dynamic.
Yeah, I really thought that was something. And so God number one is Agent.
number one is arena.
I'm sorry. Yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
And God number two is agent.
I gotcha. Okay.
And so when Jordan Peterson was talking to Sam Harris about the God that he sees, it was very arenic. It was rather impersonal, but yet quite consequential in terms of history. Now, obviously, when in that conversation they switched to talking about prayer, it was quite a bit more agentic. But as the way human beings work, that line between agent and arena is not what we think it is.
Right, especially when talking about God.
Yes. I push, I've pushed this, and part of the reason I love working in a church is, unlike academics and intellectuals and wonky people that tends to be our community online here, because we sort of find ourselves with these esoteric interests.
What are you saying, Paul?
In a church, you're talking to regular people who, when I ask them, they'll recognize the name of Plato, but they won't be able to say anything about him. And so that for me is a wonderful challenge, because I can both test ideas with them, but also I have to figure out how to talk about these things in a way that the broadest possible audience can understand.
Gotcha.
So part of what all of the last 3 years have done for me, especially conversations with a Roman Catholic scholar named Brett Sockold from Canada, who wrote a book on transubstantiation. Because if you had asked me 10 years ago if I would, transubstantiation, that's that Roman Catholic belief, which is sort of that bread turns to flesh. Well, that's just dumb. Scientifically, that's just dumb. But talking to him and reading his book, I began to appreciate, whoa, there's a lot that's going on in terms of theology, in terms of their claims about what we mean by this word God. And I look at all these footnotes in Brett Sockold's book from Bishop Barron. And then I look at this conversation, this debate that Bishop Barron has with an atheist. And I listen to John, and it's like, wait a minute. And I read, at least part of this book about, basically Hebrew revolutionary monotheism, which is very different from sort of the evolutionary polytheism that most people just suspect that the gods just all sort of became integrated, but rather that the Jews, their conceptualization of God replaced what Kaufman called an impersonal metadivine realm. That again, if you actually look at mythology, they tried to instantiate in agents such as the fates.
Right.
And even fatalism or the fates, so
totally.
So then, and the more John keeps an eye on my video stream, which is tremendously generous of his, because I put out way more than anybody should bother to listen to. But, and then I began to see, wow, John's non-theism is not that far from classical theism in many ways. And a lot of the headbutting that has happened really in the modern period about the existence of God isn't really having a very good conversation about what Christians have historically meant by the term, meant by the word. And that ignorance is shared both by, the atheists picked it up honestly from the Christians. So, don't want to, be too hard on them. So, and that for me then was an opportunity to talk to John about some of these things. So then for me, it all comes down to the question of, well, what really are our differences here? And a lot of them have to do with relationality. And, these were some of the earlier conversations that I had with John, which basically said, if let's say you're late for work and you go out and you know that your car's getting old and your car won't start, why do you talk to your car? You know,
You're letting me down here.
exactly. You name your car, you talk to your car, you plead with your car, and we will call this, we agentify our car in some way.
Yep.
But and again, that's anthropomorphizing. We have this fancy word for it. But it seems to me that is simply, and then I connected it in earlier conversation with John with a differentiation that Pascal had between sort of a spirit of geometry and a spirit of finesse. These are these two modes we approach the world with.
I was going to ask you about this and to describe this. Beautiful. Go ahead.
Yeah, and then when I read someone like Ian McGilchrist, well, these two modes, not perfectly, but sort of map onto.
You can finesse it.
That's right. This bicameral mind that we have. And I mean, of course, that maps onto all sorts of other things. And so, again, as a Christian minister, I work in the application of religion and of a religious tradition to regular people in their day-to-day life. That's what you do as a Christian minister. And so I just find these conversations around, non-theism versus classical theism, and so much of what a lot of it boils down to, I think, is the social cultural reputational hierarchies downstream from the Enlightenment, when the philosophers, for the most part, began to debunk a lot of basically they began to hold story-verse claims to matter-verse checkings.
Yep, it's a beautiful way of saying it.
And I think in a lot of ways the Enlightenment, really forced, and you see this actually in church history, because not only did you have the rise of Protestantism, which sort of championed this mode for a while, but the Counter-Reformation, was deeply a part of this too, because, for example, one of the things that the Roman Catholic Church really clamped down on were official miracles. Miracles had to be validated.
Right.
Now, one of the ironies of Wittenberg is that Wittenberg, the magistrate for Wittenberg, had accumulated one of the most impressive collection of relics, while also protecting the guy who would basically destroy the power of relics in the popular imaginary, at least for the Protestants, for a number of 100 years.
Wow. Okay.
So there's a ton going on in this. And it seems to me that where we're at right now is that if medieval Europe and medieval religiosity overplayed its hand in terms of the storyverse, modernity has overplayed its hand in terms of the physical universe.
Totally.
And what the end of modernity means is that we are once again in a period of renegotiation about the relationship between what I call these two registers.
Beautiful.
So, and I lately have been talking about upper and lower registers because.
Have you read Karen Armstrong's The Case for God?
No.
By any chance?
No.
So anyway, this landed for me in 2000. I think it was 13. I basically had this same process where I think I told you, I was raised as a new atheist kind of deal. And then I started to be like, wait a minute, the whole structure, well, it didn't turn me into a personal common sense theist. I started to get wobbly about it in terms of what do we mean. And then I read The Case for God. And basically her story is this, and it's a big, thick, complicated book. but I got the gist of it, read most, maybe half of it, and certainly took home the base message. So the message is this: there's a fundamental difference, I'll use my term here, in different kinds of justification systems. One of which is logos, okay? Logos, the logic of the day, whereby you want correspondent principles that analyze truth claims and debunk them if they're not right. And then the other is mythos, okay? Mythos is an embodied way of living in the world and a way of animating the world in a particular way and a way to relate to it in a particular way. And in the context of mythos, you don't analyze them in terms of truth claims, you analyze them in terms of meaning, basically, and embodied relationality. And therefore, the argument is that God is that which you move toward as you embody the mythos and experience the sacred. Okay. So then when I read that, I'm like, oh my God. Okay. I was like, we can embody. And then, so now if you get and listen to, so this is essentially a complete parallel to the conversation. That's why I was so enlivened by the conversation. I was like, this is the transformation I sort of went through when I read this book, and then was like, yes, I want to seek sacredness. And if you just kind of put the icon upon the lodestar, which orients my sacredness, my realization, my experience, my transcendent transformation, it's like, yeah, I'm oriented in that way. And man, does that create an enormous amount of alignment in a particular way. So that was what was resonating deeply for me.
That's really interesting. And that's very helpful. I mean, part of what I know I've struggled with is part of the reason I make so many YouTube videos is that I just simply found that the more I talk, the more I figure stuff out. Talking is better than just the little debates within my consciousness Congress. And partly because, the little debates in my consciousness Congress are all limited in here, but using YouTube to begin to work these things out verbally was far more powerful.
Yeah. And by the way, I think I owe you a tremendous debt of gratitude. You know why? Because part of what you did in your conversation with several people who did this for John, basically, but part of your conversation for John activated in him the shift into dialogos. Right? Because it was basically, wait a minute, there's a community embeddedness process here, not a rational reason and psychotechnology for the self. This is an embodied community practice, right? So in that, John and I then started the dialogos process on the Cognitive Science Show academically, not to mention the larger hyper community conversation that we're all having in relationship to this collective sense making. So, and then I got sucked into that and have experienced the power of academic dialogos with him, so that now I'm not writing papers back and forth or competing in any way. It's like connect and dialogue and watch a synergy between, I didn't think I was a Neoplatonic thinker at all, but because of dialogue with John, I'm like, oh my gosh, the Neoplatonic version. I have my Aristotle history. The tree of knowledge does matter, life, mind, culture in a very Aristotelian structural functional sense. So I've always been, natural, material, scientific, biological, organismic. And I was, that's Aristotle, Plato's up here in the damn forms. Okay. And then I'm like, no, that's not really the history. It's a lot more complicated. So anyway, that's a long-winded way of saying thank you, basically.
You're welcome. I'm not sure what I did still, but
you planted seeds of the engagement of thought, and then we made them, network them, and now there's a collective intelligence. Obviously it's one little drop in the overall bucket, but it's an important drop. So
I think so too. And the video I just put out today. So part of what, so then my channel got to a certain size, and I have a small but fairly devoted following. And then some of the guys started making clips of my videos and started doing some of what I've been doing. And so then I watch what they're doing, and you do begin to get this, even videos that I've made and things that I've said, when I see me saying them in a slightly different culture, initiates insight. And it's like, okay. and that's, you know, it's interesting to me how that's sort of in contrast with, let's say, the academic, you know, okay, now we're going to write this paper, we're going to write this book, and that's going to trickle out, and the speed of this is, you know, compared to the old system, there's liabilities too and downsides too, but it's really quite remarkable what's happening. And again, to me, for you know, as a Christian minister, a part of what develops in any communities all need boundaries. And, you know, your language too, this idea of justification systems, communities develop justification systems that allow the community to actually have productive conversation. Without those justification systems, it's sort of like the body doesn't have skin to sort of hold it in, or an exoskeleton to keep it up. So you sort of have opponent processing in that.
That's exactly right.
And so, for example, in a Protestant tradition, your justification system is some sort of, it's nowhere near as scientific as a lot of Protestants would love it to be, but it's a coherence with the biblical text.
Yep.
And still, and again, a lot of Protestants don't like to own up to this either. It's a coherence with the tradition around the conversation around the biblical text.
Yep.
And in modernity, Protestantism has sort of gotten itself into some binds because it wanted to sort of take a scientific approach to biblical interpretation. And it really doesn't work, because even scientism has, you know, scientism falls out for its own reasons too, partly because we're human beings.
Yeah, totally.
So
totally. Yeah, and I mean, I use the term scientism actually as derogatory when people are trying to over apply, you know. So yeah, totally. That's a great description. And so, yeah, for me, then the systems of justification, a word for them is capital C culture. So capital C culture then are the networked systems of justification that coordinate people and legitimize is and ought as the context or container that frame their dialogue, their behavior, their engagement, etc. So it immediately, once you enter into the context of justification, then that creates a shared culture if you're inside it. And then you understand the assumptions of is and ought, and then within then you operate. And justifications get assigned as that unit. They then also emerge against other systems. So Protestantism emerges against the, you know, authority of the Pope and Catholicism in a particular kind of way. And then science is the justification system against Christian theism in a particular kind of way. And all of our histories are then, and you have to really see their emphases and assumptions and framings and legitimizing structures as this in this network, in this larger sea of justification too, from the outside as well as then from the inside. And that gives you this dynamic flavor of what are these things about?
And I think the systems of justification, that the competing systems of justification then actually also afford, you know, interesting. Human beings don't like stasis. We need a degree of stability in order to live, but we hunger for some novelty because we want to improve the stability. So especially with, let's say, science and religion, you know, they're always sort of,
they have to be an oscillating. I think it was Peterson that once said, hey, if somebody actually gave the perfect setting, all the right answers in like a week, humans would destroy that thing.
Yeah, well, that's from Dostoevsky.
Okay, well,
that's
fair
from
enough.
Notes from the Underground. It's basically the application of Notes to the Underground to all of this.
All right, well, fair enough. But yes, absolutely. There's a complex dynamic system that's not going to be reduced to recipe and needs these oscillating aspects of between opponent processes. Totally.
You know, it was interesting. I was listening to this one philosopher who made the argument that, you know, modern philosophy, you know, the words get fudgy pretty easily, but modern philosophy partly developed in order to, in some ways, say, oh, wow, look what we're able to do with science. Let's now apply that to realms that religion used to have mastery over.
Totally.
And part of what's interesting about that is its failure to actually accomplish that.
Totally.
Not to say that philosophy has been a failure. I mean,
Nope.
philosophy has produced a lot of good knowledge.
Totally. I have a name for this called the Enlightenment Gap. Okay. So the Enlightenment Gap is once we invented science, which did such an unbelievably powerful job of mapping matter in motion, and then gave rise to a certain kind of epistemic authority. You mentioned that before. And then people were like, oh, I guess this is the way we make sense out of shit. Stuff, sorry. And then, okay, so then we go from there to, basically philosophy then has to come to terms with it. You get Kant, and Kant basically is like, well, we have epistemology, right? There's some kind of ideal epistemology and phenomenology because we can only see stuff rather than the thing itself. But he's a physicist basically too. And so you get this kind of blend. But what happens, and you can see this just across the landscape, no synthetic philosophy emerges, okay, that can jointly manage the complicated relationship between matter and mind. And this is actually within naturalism. We can then get out on, what's on the exonatural higher dimensions, if they're real or whatever, but Indo-naturalism even, meaning that we don't know matter and mind relation, which is mind-body problem, like exactly what is this physical billiard ball analysis on the one hand, and then we're actually analyzing it, feeling it, seeing it, what's that in that relation? And also, what is this scientific knowledge relative to social knowledge? Okay, so you then get the postmodern critique about the power of individual reason to establish progress, and which then is entangled with whiteness and maleness and colonialism as a justice angle, as well as basically the problem of justification, which is like all these systems are embedded in language systems that are motivated by other kinds of things. And to use a Wittgensteinian claim, they're basically language games that are always imminently situated. And you can't really, from his vantage point, you couldn't get escape from that. And so therefore, when you get that sophisticated, all these abstract claims are actually contextualized. So you get the philosophical critique, you get the justice critique about science and reason relative to social knowledge and context. And that's what the Enlightenment Gap is. It says, hey, we didn't have a knowledge system that solved the mind-body dynamic and afforded clarity between science and social knowledge. And it ultimately gives rise to a chaotic, fragmented pluralism of understanding. It just sort of, the academy just gives us a sort of blah. It's like unbelievably specialized, but poorly organized, and there's no coherent thematic structure to it at all. You just basically are like, from an academic perspective, I would argue.
It's interesting. Dallas Willard, I mentioned him to John. Dallas Willard taught philosophy at University of Southern California for most of his career. He did his doctoral work on Husserl and phenomenology. And he also was a very committed evangelical Christian who came out of, I should reread his biography, came out of sort of Baptist, holiness, Pentecostal groups, and went on then in his, later in life became, a very prominent Christian writer. And his, my favorite book of his, The Divine Conspiracy, he opens that book basically talking about what in the 80s and 90s was this crisis of morality in academia. And of course, if that crisis of morality written by, let's say, Robert Coles in the 80s and 90s was a cold, I mean, the drama over morality now in that sphere is absolutely pneumonia.
It's gone critical.
Yeah, it's gone critical. And he
unintended, but anyway.
He points out, early in a number of articles were coming out in the 80s that were noting that, here's a little story that exemplified it. A young woman, smart young woman, makes her way into Harvard and is, she's from a poor community, so she has to work while she's in school to pay the bills, et cetera, et cetera. And she's in this, she's in Harvard Medical School or something, and she's so in this ethics class with a bunch of guys who's, their fathers are doctors and graduates of Harvard, so they have all the money in the world, they don't have to work for anything. And so she winds up basically cleaning rooms of her classmates as basically a housekeeper, and they keep hitting on her. And so she eventually goes to the professor and says, I can't take this anymore, because I sit in class with these guys, and we're all, they're probably getting straight A's in their ethics class, but they can't keep their grubby hands off me when I'm trying to work my way through school,
I could so see
cleaning their rooms.
Yeah.
And so, then the professor basically says, here's an image of the modern crisis. And in some ways, as a Christian minister, I read Romans 7, the good that I would do, I don't do. And the good that I, the evil that I don't want to do, I do. And this is the Apostle Paul. Who can save me from myself? I mean, and so, we're at this point now where in some ways, so Christianity, if you look at, say, the work of Tom Holland in his book Dominion, his historical thesis is that Christianity absolutely reset the moral imagination of the West, in a radical departure from the classical world, where that eventually yielded abolition. Of course, Nietzsche got into this and said, that was the wrong turn. They have the slave morality. But Tom Holland says this completely reoriented our moral imagination.
Interesting.
Yet, and this maps onto the points that you just made. Yet, so we have this moral imagination. We all know what's right, that we have to love each other and be kind to one another and be selfless and giving and sacrificial. That has enlivened our view of the good. But where does that good map onto science? And this gets into the Wilfrid Sellers dichotomy of the manifest image and the scientific image, because you've got all of this knowledge down here in the scientific image, but you have no ought. What ought to be the speed of light? Those are living in two different realms. And so now we're sort of to the point of, we've got this postmodern rise that wants to discredit in a lot of ways the fruits of modernity. And so then you have IDW characters that are like, hey, wait a minute. We can't throw this stuff out.
The entire thing goes, and now the entire thing's going to go.
But at the same time, the fundamental, we've very few people realize that the fundamental moral imaginary of the West is simply inherited by Christianity. And so if you deracinate it and take out its roots, people like Tom Holland are like, basically, left church when he was 6 years old because they didn't believe in dinosaurs. Says, wait a minute, we're in big trouble because all this mythos. We've been debunking this mythos for 500 years, not recognizing that, it's sort of like an ecological, we've been dumping in the river, not realizing that, hey, wait a minute, that's our water source.
That's going to come back and bite us. We ought not to do that.
and so, when I look at John's project, I very much see John's project in that light, that he recognizes that, hey, wait a minute. And we don't want to give up on science by any means or technology. Clearly it's been fruitful, but we have this deep skepticism about, well, where do what exactly even are values besides things we measure down below? So
beautiful. So, and this is why, my own journey, I think, parallels John so closely. We talked about justification systems. In fact, the second key idea on the talk tree of life back there is justification systems theory, which is the idea, and it's my first key idea back in 1996 that ultimately leads to the whole architecture. And it's this idea I was learning, I was looking for an overarching idea of like organization of human psychology. And I dropped into evolutionary psychology, and I'm a scientist. So I'm like, oh, I want to be natural. Oh, that's good. And then it's like, well, actually, it's kind of broken. And in part, I realized it as I discovered this idea. Okay. And the idea is this. So we're syncing up as primates, okay? And we're getting this good capacity for intersubjective coordination, better than the other great apes. We're maybe doing chanting, maybe having broken symbols of communication, like there, antelope, okay? But the argument is maybe 200,000 years ago or whenever, the timeline will be, archaeology and everything. But clearly there's a very clear thing that happens between 200 and certainly by 50,000 years, this thing's taken off. And what is it? So from justification systems theory, it's this idea that what happened was we shifted from these symbols to a symbolic, syntactical, propositional structure. Okay, symbolic, syntactical, propositional structure. So you say there are the antelope. Okay. Now, notice that in language, the proposition is the fundamental unit of meaning, all right? And by meaning, we can now say that actually it takes up truth claims. It's a truth claim, okay? It takes up some sort of factual space or potentially factual space, okay? Which then actually gives rise to the potential of counterfactuals, all right? Now, counterfactuals actually can be accessed with easy cognitive gadgets called questions, like how, what, when, why, okay? And what they do is they then open up the possibility that maybe this factual that you and I are tending to, it's different, it's not right on the analytic correspondence side. No, they're not over there. There are no antelope over there, okay? Or in terms of our investment and our values, yeah, but the rabbits over there, okay? And I hunt rabbits better, and we're going to catch more rabbits, and we'll go over there. So now it takes up both factual space and it has shared value elements. Okay? And this thing now becomes this issue of justification. And the argument is that these justifications then create problems of accuracy or analytics, which are sort of like their truth claim value. And they also create problems for social value, like groups, like, hey, what should the group decide to be collectively justified for the interests of the group? And personal value, which is like, do I want to be focused on this? And do I want to share with you what I'm really thinking? Because with language now, you have direct access to my propositional knowing system. You can ask me questions. And unlike my old subjective experience of being, which you never have direct access to, you actually have direct access to my propositional mind. Okay, so now I got the problem of actually you have access. Why, Greg, do you think we should go hunt antelope over there? All right. And I use the example, it's a masculine example, but whatever. So if you are the alpha male and you go off hunting and you're pair bonded with somebody and I spend time with her and you come back and say, why, Greg, are you spending time with her? Okay.
Yep.
And I say, well, she's teaching me to plant seeds. Okay. Or I say, well, I hope to separate the two of you and take her as my mate.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
So now you get into this whole issue of like, what is the justification for my action? And what do I want to tell myself? And what do I want to tell you?
Right.
Okay. And that's why I'm a clinical psychologist. I see this all the time individually, but I also see this then socially. So the bottom line is, why did I bring this up now, is I got sucked into this place where this issue of fact value in science, okay, merges, very similar to John and his recursive relevance realization. So when you do recursive relevance realization, you'll hear him talk. It's like, yeah, is odd actually starts to get really weird because you see things and then you realize things and then you invest in, transjectively. And it's like, actually, that's all entangled in his theory. It's actually entangled in my theory too. Because that's the problem. Actually, one of the reasons psychology goes to hell in its conception is because you actually have these fact value science stuff is all tangled in the field. The field is very confused by this problem because it didn't have quite the right architecture. So anyway, the point of it is that part of what the solution is going to be is a scientific system that actually helps us understand the evolution of animal into human into moral values from a historical structural description. And then it's going to network together into an explanation that then is going to get tangled up with our morality. And when we get clear about all of those dynamics, we'll be in a much better place to sort this thing out. But historically, they weren't at all. And they separated the two very, very strongly, which made some sense, but they overshot it. And we have to figure out actually the way to bring that dialectic back with clarity.
When I look at the scientific method, and I'm not a scientist, so correct me if I'm wrong.
Sure.
When I look at the scientific method, I see the very reasonable attempt to reduce variables into, the reduction of variables means that we are looking for small causative relationships that are at least reliable and durable to depend on. They don't have to be 100% because very little we have is 100%. And so we're trying to eliminate all of these variables. When it comes down to values, I mean, and not just values, but just about every other aspect of us as human beings, the reduction of variables makes a world of sense in terms of trying to, again, get down to things that we sense are durable. We can say yes and no.
Yeah.
Taking Tylenol will help my headache. Yes. Taking Tylenol will cure my cancer. No. I might not feel my cancer pain as much, but so then we ask, well, does taking Tylenol help cancer? And so part of what I see, the difficulty of even the scientific method is it relies upon the reduction of variables. And so then, and I think actually this is a function of consciousness, because as I say often, consciousness is monofocal. I mean, that is one of our real limitations and powers.
Yeah. Okay.
Focus. But then when you have two things, it's sort of, then you have a binary, then you have yes, no.
Yep.
And when you have three things, now suddenly things get complicated because you can have 2 and 1. And so 3 is sort of the limit. After 3, everything's just many, And so part of the difficulty I see, even in that little story that you told, and a lot of, I listen to Jonathan Haidt and some of these people. So why should we go hunting for those antelope? Do I really know? Now I can obviously, there's a whole bunch of very reasonable things, such as I'm hungry, I want to get food for the tribe, but I don't think you very quickly get an enormous range of reasons.
Yep.
And like with a bunch of the split brain stuff, when it comes to psychology, we always want to say, well, the reason for this is, and well, that's probably a reason for that. But when and this is the nightmare of skepticism. And I think it's deeply related to John's meaning crisis. The reason I feel may or may not have a lot to do with, well, and then the question is, well, how would I know the real reason, or even a usable short list of real reasons? I remember looking at a video of comparing, they were doing chimp exercises and young children, where there's a little candy treat and the experimenter would tap a bunch of things. Most of the things had nothing to do with, let's say, the relevance realization of moving the slide and getting the treat. And, the chimps very quickly realized all the tapping, they got the treat. The kids would religiously tap, 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 tap. And again, that looks, we would tend to look at that and say, well, that monkey is clearly more reasonable than the child. But part of human beings is not only relevance realization, but it seems to be our awareness that our relevance realization is inadequate. So we ironically ape the experimenter.
Totally. Yep. Exactly.
Because we don't know. And of course, we look at then the tapping and say, well, that to me looks like religious liturgy. So,
beautiful.
So it's, it's very interesting to me to look at what sits at the basis of science, which is the absolutely necessary and tremendously powerful relevance realization effort of reducing variables, when built into us seems to be, I think, biologically, the suspicion that we're not smart enough to know them all.
Totally.
I don't know if this makes any sense or is helpful anyway.
Oh, it's well, I mean, this is what I do. So there's beautifully articulated and helpful, and certainly there's all these confusions about science, just like the church, right? So for example, like science, the first thing I'm going to do when we talk about what our referent is with science is to differentiate scientific epistemology from scientific ontology. Okay, so scientific epistemology is the process by which we engage in scientific analysis and critical thought. All right, and one of the things that science does then is it shifts the focus of its source into what's called third-person empiricism. Okay, so it basically says get outside of your subjective experience and get into a position where an observer could be substituted. So we get basically intersubjective, objective observational capacity, which then also then gets measured in quantification, and then systematic analysis of variables in relationship to quantification. Okay, and then the processes by which you align those variables to say there's a identifiable, reliable, valid relationship between them. And then we compare that to other explanations and then arrive at the best network of explanations to deduce and justify our conclusion. Okay, so that's all epistemology, but it doesn't say anything about the nature of reality at any level, which is then ontology. Okay, now science comes with naturalistic assumptions at some level, which creates some sort of assertion that at some level the cause effect, it will be cause effect one worldism. Okay, and more basic causes will somehow affect higher order causes, although there's a huge amount of debate about that. All right, but science, you offered what I would say one of the great errors of science is a physicalist reductionism ontology, which is just wrong. It's just completely, I would argue, it's completely wrong. A raw, greedy physical reductionism. Okay, so that's that's one of the errors of the Enlightenment. It's like, oh, we can reduce all this to billiard ball matter. I'm just a bunch of atoms jiggling like billiard balls inside of me. And this entire conversation, if I knew all the variables on that, we could then turn these into, I'm a billiard ball machine. I've heard people say after, class in neuroscience, oh, it's just a bunch of chemicals. That's what I am. It's like, not at all. 100% not at all. That's wrong across multiple levels. So to me, what we need to do is we need to update science ontology. So we don't make the error that it's like, oh, science says that you're actually, might as well just say this entire conversation is, well, it's a product of quantum field fluctuations. That's one. Does that mean anything? So was your conversation with John. And so every other conversation you've ever had. So actually all the relevant properties of everyone that we actually discriminated on, they're all just quantum field fluctuations. So actually it's meaningless to say it's quantum field fluctuations. That's not what made your conversation beautiful and brilliant and a wonderful dance. So we know that. And so don't, the issue that people try to make that reduction ontologically is just an error. And we ought to correct that.
I love how you put, the third person empiricism is something, what I often call it, sort of a monarchical vision. And I think what you talked about in terms of the naturalistic assumption, I often talk about that as sort of the lab leak, because here's this tool that was really helpful in helping Galileo figure out, dropping billiard balls. Well, let's apply this to everything. It's like everything is really big.
Right. And he didn't,
really
and nor
big.
did Newton think you could. Newton's
Yeah.
unbelievably religious in relation and basically said, no, stop it at life, and certainly at soul. That doesn't mean anything in relation. You know, and then other people are like, well, but the dual world stuff doesn't really work. So all we're left with is physical causation. Ergo, everything reduced to physical causation, and then you just get a nightmare.
What's interesting to me about so then you have this, then okay, that about, where was I going with this? So Newton was talking, so let me get back to where I was. So you have this monarchical vision, and that's the way that we can see the world. And, we've added now a couple of centuries of nuance into this. The pragmatists brought in statistics, which was enormously helpful. And so then when let's say we roll out a vaccine, we can say this vaccine is going to be safe and effective and then we're going to put a statistical number on it, because the amount of complexity in a human body with respect to immune systems, viruses, and at the end of modernity, though, what we're sort of, again, bumping into is, once again, the reintegration of the subject into it. And to me, and of course, we're running this massive social experiment right now as a world. To me, I don't care if Pfizer is 99.99999, if it doesn't work for grandma,
Totally
done.
Right.
And so
no, that's 100%. In fact, we should think about this, I'll play off your God 1, God 2, and we should have science 1, epistemology, which is the methods by which we would then know stuff, versus scientific ontology. And people get this confused all the time.
Yeah,
when we introduce the COVID vaccine, we have some scientific ontological notions about what may or may not happen.
Right.
But there's so much variation. We got to drop it in and see.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
And then we'll get some ratio. And there's no assertion that it's not going to be your grandma that's in the, oh, sorry about that, but that's error. And overall, this is good for all of us. And you're like, but I'm error.
There's no such thing as all of us when it comes to me.
Yeah, my life's one of n, n of one, and it's like, if I'm on the backside, how do you screwed me over with this whole thing? And it wouldn't matter if obviously 90% of people have trouble, the whole thing goes. But if you're in the bad category, then you're in the bad category, and that's your reality. So the issue is, yes, you have policymakers that are operating sociologically, which you do want to make those kinds of issues up. But psychologically, and your life issues are like totally different level of analysis.
Right.
They're not a statistic when you're just yourself. You're an n of 1, and it's either in or out, and that's a totally different kind of dynamic. So totally, 100%.
I remember where I was going to go with Newton now. No, sorry, I had forgotten. I mean, because when I got into my God number 1 and God number 2, one of the things that I realized was when Newton was developing his mechanics in terms of a God number 1 space, for him, he was doing theology. Because what's interesting about, there's lots of questions about why did the kinds of science we tend to relate as science today, why did this develop in Christendom as it did?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question.
And I think part of it is because of the seeming relational stability of this God was leveraged to say that balls will fall from an Italian tower at the same rate anywhere within this God's kingdom. Now, of course, Galileo is really critical in in basically destroying the discarded image, as C.S. Lewis calls it, because once they begin to demonstrate that physics above the moon works in the same way as physics below the moon, and of course people today will say, why is the moon so important? Well, in the discarded image, the moon was the boundary between the realms. So, that's sort of where God number one comes in, because this, when, for example, even in popular folk religion out in the world, people will say, God made me. Okay. I thought it was your mom and your dad. No, God made me this way. I thought it was genetic inheritance of how many successful pairs on back through history. When they say God made me this way, they're talking God number one.
Beautiful.
But leveraging in God number two. Because what they're saying is, they're both saying, well, this is all of human history, and quantum fluctuation and biochemistry and evolution, all of those things. But then they're appropriating a divine choice, instrumentation, and authority that boils down to whatever aspect they're talking about, whether it be gender sexual orientation, or eye color, or skin color, or what have you, whatever we're fighting about. So, that to me is where this God number one and God number two is just all over the place with us, except in certain conversations, because of the Enlightenment, we sort of drew this line.
Totally.
And both sides are playing on these fields. Because again, the facts and the values, you're not really going to pull them apart.
Right.
Because all of our facts are the products of, and I think this is one of the real things that Jordan Peterson sort of opened my eyes to. All of these facts are the products of all of these human values, even within a short 10,000 year window.
Totally. I mean, they call them the evolution of justification systems.
Talk a little bit more about your justification systems.
Okay, so I just gave the description, this thing of propositions, okay? And then it creates an on-the-ground adaptive problem of justification for living embodied organisms, animals, primates that we are, okay? So we're primates syncing up together, doing our hunter-gatherer thing, and now we created these propositions, which afford us all sorts of wonderful abilities to coordinate, okay, and make claims in a totally different light, but they come with a tremendous problem. It's like this problem of justification, like which propositions do we invest in and are influenced by, okay? So then this creates the problem of accuracy, the problem of social shared value, and the problem of personal value, okay? So and this is to said basically really take off, say 100,000 years ago, all right? And then what happens is that in the question answer dialogue between tribal groups, people find their way to normative structures of understanding that create a context of justification, which are basically the shared belief values, or capital C cultural structures that then the group finds to be sense-making at the shared propositional level. Oh, this is what's happening. This is what the gods want. This is what the animated spirits afford. And this is, if we behave this way, good things happen. If we behave bad, this will happen. The fates out there, we animate them, and then we create a particular kind of way of relating to them. And then we can all harmonize our structure together. And then there's more and more evolution. You get more and more difficulty because you actually have this one goddamn question in particular. One question in particular. Why? Okay. Why? It's an unbelievably complicated question, okay, of causes and reasons all tangled up together. So now we have this cognitive gadget, and if they've been around 3-year-olds or 4-year-olds who are precocious, why, Dad? Why don't we eat cookies before? Why are you balding? Why is the sky blue? It's like, just that's the way it is. Eventually, you say, kid, that's what, or you say that's because of the gods. right? And so you then have to develop a sort of a container that frames the system, or else you'll be chaotic, fragmented pluralism like a current structure. All right. So then you get the evolution of culture, capital C culture, and you get more and more investment in both that affords you understanding technologies. I think it basically creates a collective intelligence that allows the system to evolve into more and more adaptability. And ultimately we get civilization. There's a lot of debate now about like exactly how far back we go, but say 10,000 years at least, and maybe 30, who knows? But then you get more and more structures. And then I would argue that actually you go from oral indigenous tribal systems of justification into then civilized systems of justification. There's a fundamental transition. It can, at the current, I'm hedging because there's some new work coming out in the dawn of everything and a few other books that are like, But if we just go with a sort of standard, we see the evolution of civilization, certainly sort of the Bronze Age civilization, say 5,000 years ago. Okay, so with Bronze Age civilizations, you now have massive cities. Cities are no longer moderated by oral traditions. They have to be fundamentally organized by a higher order set of refined traditional claims. You basically get then the religious God nation states, okay, that then basically then afford a city. So you don't negotiate this, you get socialized into a macro level system that then is contained by the refined and established hierarchical authority that regulates things like the control of production, these king, pharaoh gods that then afford and then they interface with the modes of production, the industries of say, military control and regulation of commerce and everything else. And then see that you, at the Bronze Age, you get these different civilizations that are mostly mono-organizational at the institutional, industrial, justificatory structure. But then then that collapses in 12 whatever, and then there's the horrible period. And then you get the reestablishment during the Axial Age, where we then see the emergence of what we then can now identify as the great wisdom traditions. And then civilization gets more and more diverse in terms of it. You get a breakdown in sort of things like commerce and markets versus religion, and then law and modernity does this again, but it splits these, what my friend Robert Ryan calls magistrates. I think that's the right word. Anyway, but that's the constellation of justifications and societal institutions that then legitimize and then have the power, authority, money, military to enact those controls. And then you get the emergence of the traditional formal period of, say, over the last 5,000 years, Bronze Age first, then Axial Age. Then 500 years ago, we get modernity, and it's, you get the Renaissance into Enlightenment, the emergence of, the Enlightenment philosophy, Enlightenment science, democratic liberal ideals, capitalism, etc. You get that explosion. It overthrows a lot of the traditional ideals. And then over the last 50 years, we get the postmodern critique. So it's actually interestingly algorithmic or logarithmic. 50,000. In fact, you can go back to 500,000 when we're basically just doing the dance symbolically, but without propositions. And then you get 50,000, and then you get 5,000, and you get 500, and you get 50. Yeah, these phases, true. And some people think about 5 years, we're going to pop into something else.
Well, at what point do we, do we go so fast? I mean, I that's sort of where we're at. Change is happening so fast that you wonder if the old, system, it's sort of like taking, let's say you have a rail line and you put faster and faster locomotives on your rail, but all of your curves and your grades have been designed for, now you've got twice the horsepower. They say, oh, we can do 200 on this. And an engineer will say, you aren't going to do that curve at 200 miles an hour. It's going to go blink.
Totally. So, right. So then the question, and my hopeful side basically says this digital virtual will somehow forward an opportunity of a metaverse, to use I used to use that term, now Facebook.
Thanks, Facebook.
I mean, I had a metaculture metaverse.
Trademark the word the.
Yeah, no doubt. So there it is. But ultimately the digital virtual metaverse, and then the question is to me, whether or not we actually have the intellectual, philosophical, scientific, humanistic, theological containers that afford us understanding that enable wisdom, or if we have a chaotic, fragmented pluralism, we go right off the rails. That's basically the structure of my analysis. And the hope and the beauty of all of these conversations, in my opinion, are the seeding of the necessary ontological, epistemological, axiological value structures that maybe we get together dialogue about, like, oh my God, if we treat this the right way, we have an enormous amount of wisdom, and we could actually build the right kind of digital metaverse around this and stop having all these positional justificatory battles and actually live in an integrated pluralism where I, as an old school new atheist, come to you as a Christian minister, you help me find God. I see it now, in a kind of particular way. And that to me is like that. There's a beauty and a hope in there that I certainly have. So that's one frame on it.
That's very interesting. Wisdom is, of course, a word that is, getting a lot of play across a certain, especially in this corner of the internet and a little wider in the Jordan Peterson verse. And wisdom to me is a word that is interesting when it comes to things like scale, because let's say I grew up in Paterson, New Jersey, and the Passaic River snakes through it. In order to win the world wars in the first half of the 20th century, New Jersey, if you look at Superfund sites in the United States, New Jersey is like the king of Superfund sites. Part of that is because a lot of the industrial capacity that the United States revved up to beat the Nazis and the Japanese in the Second World War came at the expense of the easiest way to get rid of certain chemicals was simply pour them in the Passaic River. And so you have this really quite a beautiful river in northern New Jersey that don't eat the fish. In fact, when I was a kid, I made a comment on Twitter and somebody took offense at it, because when I was a kid, we'd go to the Great Falls, and because there's a significant waterfalls right there in Passaic, but when you'd come home from the Passaic Falls, it'd be like, why do I smell so dirty? Because all that mist just covered my body. So we get into this question of wisdom. Yeah. And when I was talking to John too, I was talking lately about there's sort of with let's say a classical religious structure. You are living within, let's say, an entire cosmos, and you have access to the stars that you navigate by, the word of God that comes down to you. You have all of these things. And this wisdom then in some ways, scales. And yes. So if you have one way to understand, let's say a book like the Bible, is that you've got all of this scaling of wisdom. Now, obviously, if you're a theologian or a biblical scholar, you begin to see that, there's a lot going on here. But if you're a pastor, you're sort of a popularizer, sort of like, let's say a clinical therapist who on one hand has done all of this education. On the other hand, you're sitting with a client who is in pain, who is, in theological terms, shalom has been broken. Their life is a bundle of pain. Their relationships are a mess. They're the product, let's say, of a dysfunctional family. The patterns that have been produced by that family are now inherent in this person, which have played out in their relationships, yada, 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 yada. And so what you want to do is bring wisdom. And of course, that wisdom has to be scaled appropriately so that, the whatever degree of agency that person has can sort of pick up on it and begin to build, as John would say, reciprocal broadening. So, the therapist gives the person, well, why don't you try this in your conversation with your daughter? Instead of saying this like you usually say, why don't you say this? And a week they come back and say, I said that. And, we still had kind of a fight, but it wasn't as bad as the fight of the week before. Oh, good.
We put a basement on it. We're layering the basement.
That's right. So now we've got a new tool where you can talk to your daughter, and maybe you'll still have fights with her, but the fights won't be so bad. And then, we're going to sort of build up from there. I mean, that's wisdom. And and part of it seems to me that the continual human struggle that we deal with is always the scaling of this wisdom.
Totally. Love that.
And how far can we push these things? I mean, dumping dioxins in the Passaic River during the Second World War was really helpful in terms of beating the Nazis and the Imperial Japanese Army. It wasn't so good for the fish and the little boy who grew up in Paterson, New Jersey, who saw these beautiful falls, and nobody could ever bathe in that river.
Totally.
So, part of it seems we're really struggling for is, so you've got religious systems that tend to have traditionally scale.
Yep.
And some of these, some of the fiercest debates in religions, like in my church right now over, say, same-sex marriage, is same-sex marriage a good thing? And so right now, a lot of people would say, well, obviously we know that some people are same-sex attracted. We know that marriage is generally better than, let's say, serial monogamy, and often better than just promiscuity. And so why not adapt a traditional institution for men and women, adapt it for a same-sex couple to sort of fix? But then you're going to have, more complexity questions like, will that work the same for lesbians as it will work for gay men?
Yeah.
Well, and then, but as you said, with the speed, part of what I deal with in a church conversation is a lot of the people who are now in their 60s and 70s and 80s who are saying, oh, this adaptation makes sense because all that we really need to do is make this adaptation for gay couples, and the whole system will just sort of normalize. And being a younger person living in a little more dynamic area of the country, it's like, no, you don't understand. There are a lot more conversations coming down the road here, such as man born in a woman's body, such as gender fluidity. The question of monogamy is itself in many ways up for grabs, whether given birth control, life expectancy, yada, 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 whether that institution continues to be viable. And I mean, again, this is where we get into not only scale, but also plurality, because as someone like a minister or a therapist, but especially a minister, whereas a therapist is sitting across from one person, and the goal of that therapist is saying, let's see if we can afford wisdom and engender shalom in just your life.
Right.
The minister is sitting in a community and saying, I can really see how for these two gay people, monogamy could nicely fix and settle them, and maybe they'll adopt some kids, and that could really sort of leverage this heterosexual institution and afford them some affordance. But what about the bi? What about the fluid? And more importantly, what about all of the relations between these 2 to 1,000 people that I have in my community?
Totally.
Especially how this connects us to now a book that we have been revering for thousands of years, that has been a guide both for wisdom in the heavenlies, but also wisdom on the ground. And so, for me as a pastor, we're sort of in a nexus of, and so it's very easy to just sort of, okay, well, I'm going to put up big walls, and I'm going to say, you're a scientist, I'm not going to listen to. You're an atheist, I'm not going to listen to you. But is that, then we see communities doing that. So then we take a step back again later and say, okay, these communities have very high rigid walls. How are they doing? What are the metrics? Well, sort of dead reckoning metrics. Are they doing well? But then those dead reckoning metrics have questions about time. They might be doing really well right now.
Totally.
But 100 years from now, are they going to fall off the map?
Right.
So, I mean, this is, I think, part of where a lot of pastors like me, on one hand, look at science and say, yeah, we could really use some allies because, well, I got that polio vaccine and we don't see a lot of polio around. But at the same time, the level of complexity in the kinds of things that we're facing, with the kinds of acceleration that you really nicely just laid out. Yeah, we're this train is a rocking, baby.
Just brilliantly stated. No, 100% agree with that. So, I love the reference and the connection of the therapist and I straddle this one. So I'm trained as a theoretical psychologist, at first a behavioral scientist. So, it's like, I'm the science guy and also the atheist guy and the arrogance, basically Sam Harris, guy. All right. That's what I was, and I was like, oh, Sam Harris, well, I'll pray to Sam Harris. Perfect. I was like, no, actually, and so anyway, but part of the issue is once I do that, I shifted into the therapy room. I mean, this whole story is that and then the whole question of science when the therapy room is totally different. Okay. You're dealing with N of one. All right. And then you have this whole issue of values, like what is wisdom? And then what is wisdom for my client? And then what is wisdom in relationship to society? Okay. So like Martin Luther King, I mean, he basically said, hey, you psychologists gave us a great word, maladjusted. Okay. And you have done wonderful things in helping people reverse their maladjusted neuroses. And at the same time, there's some things we should never be maladjusted to. Okay. Or our maladjustment basically is the diagnostic of the maladjusted society. So our distress at racism and oppression, right, is a function of society, not you, not the person. And then the question is, well, right, how and what? Okay. And like today, like we get the priests of Stoicism. My mentor, Aaron T. Beck, just died earlier this week. And Stoicism, he basically formalized Stoicism into cognitive therapy. Okay. And cognitive therapy is the hyper-rational analysis of adaptive thinking that you then embody. And you don't let sort of neurotic stuff that you're not sure of, get you down. Okay. And you reframe it so that it's basically affords you not to drop into a neurotic cycle and to be adaptive and resilient. Okay. And to be regulated. All right. We are now getting a massive movement also to highlight the fact that, hey, man, if you're a person of color or in other ways marginalized, there's a whole systemic racism and you're exposed to microaggressions. Okay. By the very words that people use, like, oh, it's a melting pot. And, I think everybody's got equal opportunity. No, that's actually a microaggression that is systematic in relationship to the history of justification that undermines you. And if you thought that maybe it did, it did. Okay. Now that's a completely different prescription than Stoicism. Stoicism would say, what's evidence, and err on the side of, and in fact, Jonathan Haidt is making this point and basically being like, a lot of what we're doing in this social subjective concern about the individuals, we're creating raw nerves. Everyone now is hunting for their own victimization, which virtually all the wisdom traditions say. So my point basically that I teach people Thomas Szasz's famous claim, Thomas Szasz's the critic of psychiatry, and then looked at us as therapists. He's like, you guys are secular priests. So he called us. Yeah. Okay. And it's totally right. It's like, we're now the bearers of wisdom, but we scientize it and we individualized it. We weren't trained to place it in context. Okay. So we see the injustice, and the worry, and then we're going to now validate your subjective wanting because we see the person in the therapy room but I always ask my students is like, well, if we validated everybody's subjective desires in the way we unconditionally positively value your client, what do you think we'd have on our hands? An absolute freaking nightmare. Because everybody now would feel, could you imagine what it would be as everybody wanders around with a little therapist that gives them all what they want subjectively to support them and validate their feelings? I was like, imagine a couple, they come in, you're like, God, you listen, you validate, you say, I can't believe that spouse. And right down the hall, the other spouse is talking to the other person and he gets together.
As a pastor, I've watched this happen.
And then it's like, and then each therapist, oh God, I had a client, it was such a nightmare, her spouse and his spouse. And then actually, oh wait, the guy I was validating is your evil person on the other side of the equation. And it's like, you multiply that out and you get unbelievable disaster. And we therapists think at the individual level. We don't think at the community level. So I completely empathize with your perspective in that regard, and our wisdom capacity to understand community systems. In fact, I originally trained in community psychology, which is enormously critical of the clinical psychology's narrowness and the failure to appreciate the community level of analysis and the nature of what is healthy and wise for a community. So I just basically, it's a long rant to say totally, Paul.
Well, that's very interesting. That's very interesting. You know, and I think, so when I look at, say, when Peterson distinguishes in his own little dictionary definition between religion and let's say ideology, and, you know, that's a rather particular redefining them and what he does for his rhetorical reasons, which I understand. It's very effective, I think. But I mean, part of what religious traditions afforded were, you know, mass. I mean, so you have all of these problems, and it's a nice, I know pastors that get a little reluctant. Initially, they're like, oh, these people are having a marriage crisis. Well, let's send them to the therapist, and the therapist will sort it out. And then they come back from the therapist, and the therapists are like, oh, for your well-being, you know, you should really get rid of the slouch. And the pastor's like, yeah, but there's three little kids on this train here that I understand it might be in her best interest right now to get rid of the slouch. I totally get that. But I'm not sure that's good for the three. And I'm not sure, you know, you have all these family systems. And so what we had with religions were, at least we had systems that they weren't perfect by any means, but they kept the train on the tracks.
Totally.
But then what you had, of course, you'd have, I mean, we've been scaling out for a long time. Let's say you had the tribe, and then they had the clan, and then you had, you know, you look at kingdoms, you know, go back to the you know, the Iron Age, early Bronze Age. You've got kingdoms, and then you have empires, and empires are accumulations of kingdoms. And, you know, like you said in your narrative nicely, I think, you know, we've been scaling up since then. And, you know, 1493, we had the Columbian Exchange. Suddenly the entire planet begins to form a network. You have trade networks, you have thought networks. And so then I think in some ways we, you know, in this little corner of the internet, what we're grasping for and trying to practice towards is, okay, how can these networks interact in a productive way?
Right.
We've got a pastor, and we've got, you know, a therapist and a psychologist, and these worlds have to intersect because, and in fact, they have been interacting in the wild all along. But we want to get to a place where we can begin to say, and I think we've made progress in the last 20 years. You should talk to your pastor about that. As I'm now having people in the church say, I was talking to my therapist, and my therapist said I should have a conversation with you. Good. I'm glad to hear that.
Yeah, totally.
So, but again, the speed question, I think, is, if you look at someone like Brett Weinstein and his anxiety, I very much understand his anxiety about the speed question. And I think we've been, especially since the development of atomic weapons, that's raised the anxiety because we begin to realize, yeah, we can nuke each other. And I think now, since the last 60 years, since the development of atomic weapons, we've also become recognized that, okay, we can actively kill each other, but we've got anxiety as to whether or not the systems that we are relying upon are in fact going to be able to continue to scale, and if the accumulation of all of those systems won't collapse
completely.
And that then, see, so when I listen to, so then I do a little relevance realization, listening to John and some of the non-theist conversation. I say, okay, what's the critical piece beneath, let's say, the God or no God, very low resolution conversation. Even if we've got, okay, so our non-theism and our our classical theism aren't, they're not that far apart. You've got, you know, the Neoplatonism, and so much of that is already built into Christianity that we're close enough to be conversant and in fact live fairly well together. The piece that I see as maybe the defining difference, and I love how you phrase this with respect to your propositions, is whether or not there is a conscious, all-powerful, intentional authority that is going to ensure in some way a good outcome.
Yep.
And that seems to me to be in some ways the difference. And then we begin to negotiate about the pragmatic value of that question. Oh, if you have that question, then you're going to be a slouch. Or if you don't have that question, you're going to be a neurotic and, you know, be useless to the system because your anxiety takes you away. So to me,
totally.
And so then you have someone like me as a pastor in a church assuring people there's a God in heaven above who, even when you slough off this mortal coil, as a Christian, it's not just a Platonist where you're going to go off and lose your body and be blissful and get to talk to Socrates in some disembodied form, but in a Christian that you'll be reunited with your flesh and you can have all of the loss that you've endured can someday be restored. And now suddenly we are going to have another interesting conversation about, I don't know, should you be filling people's minds with ideas like that? I mean, that's sort of where I've seen sort of a detente between the camps right now. A lot of the celebrity atheists have gone off to fight the woke wars, and the Christians have too. So, okay, we're not going to fight with atheists on the internet anymore. We're going to fight with woke and non-woke. But that seems to be sort of where, in many ways, the difference really lies.
I love that. Yeah, I think that's exactly right. That's the crux of the justificatory split that you really are aligned. And here's where so I'm on one side of the camp, socialized, and now I've come all the way up to the line. Okay. I actually I found this thing called syntheism. Okay. From a friend of mine, Alexander Bard, and the way he frames it over in Europe and his leadership, I would frame it slightly differently, but I've been really influenced by his leadership on it. And it's essentially can be, for me, I would summarize my American version of this or whatever of syntheism, is I now believe in the concept of God. Okay. In fact, I generated a thing called the elephant sun god, which is an iconic representation of that concept that now sits over my garden. Okay. And so that's the God of light. Okay. An integrated, pluralistic, very powerful God of light. I intentionally did it because there's one of the most ancient gods is essentially an elephant sun god from Hinduism. So, which is almost in the exact opposite on Earth between West and where I am in East. And so I can see the elephant sun god rising above through Ra and all just the icons of all the gods of light. Okay, from an integrated pluralism. So the elephant is both the symbol of power, but it's also from the Hindu or Indian tradition of 5 blind men and the elephant. So we see it from different angles. So, and that then also is sort of Tillich's ultimate concern. I can put myself in using John's language of, well, it builds off for a few other people, but my divine double is then placed in relationship to that. What is the ultimate representation of me being good across scales of wisdom so that I can be a good ancestor in the largest space of time? And that God would then reflect off of my actions. And if I'm placed in right relationship to that, I feel a sense of, transcendent, realization and that, that gets into then that I feel spiritually, sacredly engaged in relationship to that. So for me, then now I'm like, I was raised as a new atheist where it's just, oh, God's a myth in the bad Santa Claus sense of the word. I'm now like looking at myself like, oh my God. It's like, not, sort of, but right up against the whole, actually, my entire life is starting to become aligned in relationship to the concept. So it's a fascinating evolution of my own structure.
That is fascinating. it's almost like the new atheist said, your gods are made up. And you said, watch me.
Yeah, that's syntheism. Exactly. It's believing in the concept of God and the God we create and affording that light and then putting yourself in relationship to that and then feeling the sacredness of that alignment.
That's fascinating. Now I want to be careful with this question. Now I'm going to be John Vervaeke, being all concerned about, I don't want to offend you with my question. Is it knowing that you rationally constructed this, does that undermine its potency in terms of you're relating to it?
No. But remember, every context of justification, everything, I'm coming from the idea that the whole concept is foolish. I now believe in how spiritual it is in relation. So I'm not coming from the other side, which would be like, if you were to believe that it's ontically real or ontologically real, and then you had to rotate that around and then said, oh, well, actually, it's just in my head, that would be a totally different relation. But for me, when I go from, and then I discover, because I'm discovering the naivete and the arrogance of my own position, okay, my own historical position. And it's enlightening me and humbling me in relation, okay? So as a function of all of that, it carries with it a particular kind of, it's a particular kind of sacred relation. It's not the sacred, but it's my identification with it that affords a sacredness, at least in terms of my own fundamental experience of, I feel very attached to it or in love with it, or I want to, in that regard. And I heard you and John talking about the God of the arena, which, by the way, then this is terms of nature and cosmos and a sense of oneness with the cosmos. That sense of, and then Plotinus oneness and Neoplatonic kind of idea, and then seeing all the great wisdom traditions now affording me a channel, it feels very, very powerful to me.
What about the communal aspect of this? I mean, it's on one hand, pragmatically, to have a God of that you've in some ways, boy, this is just fascinating. Because part of, so James Wellman, he's the uncle of a guy that I've had on my channel a number of times, who's a programmer up in Seattle. James Wellman has been he's written some books on mega churches. Okay. Part of the, I can translate it into Vervaekian terms. Part of the psychotechnology of mega churches is scale. If you can get 2, 3, 4, 5,000 people together in a room, I mean, Jonathan Haidt recognizes this. You get thousands of people together in a room. They're all focusing on one name. They're all focusing on one image. They're singing together. In some traditions, they might be chanting together. I mean, part of the limitation of this syntheism, I'm gonna have to look into this more, seems to be scale, because I mean, you would obviously a religion that has millions, even billions of people that are, well, they've all got their questions within it, but there's a degree of alignment through it. Yeah, potentially could have tremendous impact in terms of a psychotechnology. Whereas totally. Although it sounds like you're sort of appropriating some ancient traditions and bringing them together.
Right. So that's a great question. And I can really just speak for myself. I'm on a pretty unique journey. Okay. So like as I tell all my students, I'm like, be aware if you don't work with me, I'm weird. I'm like way out there. Okay. In relationship to the ground of psychological science or the academy or other things. Okay. So, the journey that I'm on, I got teleported basically into a different conceptual space back in 1996, 1997, really through the justification portal. And then I built this thing called the tree of knowledge. And it was then this tree of knowledge that afforded me a way to understand essentially objective scientific psychology in relationship to the rest of science, natural science, and separate it from subjective psychology and know how to manage that difference, which nobody really had gotten quite right. And at first I was then going to be, oh, I'll do psychology, but then the thing backs up and then it turned into this whole ultimately, then it comes back into a garden. I call it the tree of knowledge and then back into the garden. Okay. So it's like, I'm like, think of me like sort of the whole theistic, atheistic thing now running in reverse in my own.
Yes.
You know, it's like sucked into the mirror image of that in my own weird, mythology, as it were. And I've just been following that, and my wife refers to me as a knowledge archaeologist because I just go and I'm just following that. I mean, and so I'm alone in this. This is definitely, I'm so thankful to find John because I see him climbing up a mountain. I've been climbing this particular terrain, but I don't work with anybody else. I just build this on my own. Because it's just an architecture that my heart, soul, spirit saw and has been pulled into in a particular way. And, sharing it with other people is very hard because it's a very, very complex labyrinth of sets of, ideas that blend normal categories in weird ways.
Yeah, I can understand that. What does your wife think of this?
Mixed. We've been married since we were high school sweethearts. So she knew me as a normal person. I was a normal person, when we got married, and she stayed a normal person like most people are. But I got teleported into a different dimension essentially. And that's been very cool on the one hand, but it's challenging on another.
So, where John has his religion that's not a religion and, looking for communities of, all the things that John's working on. So where are you in that? You've got your system. Yeah. Is this something that you want to expand, or is this, how does that work for you?
Yeah. So, I've been connecting with people a lot and people have been interested in it. They see the value. I published on it. I built a thing called the Theory of Knowledge Society. So it's about 170 people or so on a listserv, basically. I've had a couple of conferences. So people are following this at a particular level. I've got maybe 30 doctoral students who I've graduated. And I now see, there's a whole story here, but basically I was trying to leverage this inside the academy. The academy just really didn't know what to do with it.
I can believe that.
They didn't know what the hell was going on here. And I'm like, hey, I think I found some answers over here. People are like, what the hell? Individually, everyone's like, that's fascinating. Systemically, it's like, what the hell? Okay, because there's no collective. It's just some weirdo going like, I think I got some real answers here. And then what happened is in 2016, it was already weird. And then it launched into the garden. I had to calling, and there's a whole story there I need to get into, but I had this artistic spiritual vision of it becoming a garden in a conference called Cultivating the Globally Sustainable Self of a bunch of transformational educators. And basically they're brilliant people, had all sorts of, and then at the end, there was this question about, well, how do we do this? And everybody just stumbled over this question. It's like, it was too macro, too meta, too big. People like, I don't know what the self is. I don't know how we do that, blah, blah, blah. I walked out of there and I had the system called a two at the time. It's like, well, plant it to a seeds and grow it to a trees. That's how you do this. Okay. And then it was like, oh my God, I could see an entire garden of knowledge that you could socialize people into. And, weird thing, like the stone back there is called the stepping stone. Okay. That grounds the garden. STEP stands for Standard Theory of Elementary Particle Physics. So it's like, oh, yeah, and you could pick up a rock and you learn Newton and you could drop it like off the Leaning Tower of Pisa. And then as you get older and older, layers come off and there's like, oh, underneath that rock are things like atoms. And oh, underneath atoms are things like quarks. Okay. And that's the layer and nature of the system. But I turned my theory into a cartoon garden. Okay. The academy is like, you don't get peer reviewed on that. You're just sort of like, who do you send that to, right? Okay, but And so essentially then what happened is I'm trying to do this and Jordan Peterson comes along. Okay. And I'm like, oh, hey, Jordan Peterson, this is exactly the conversation we should be having. But unfortunately, in the universities, actually, you say that, and the meter on the left is so much as like, well, if you think we should pay attention to him, you're probably evil. Okay.
Yeah.
And I'm like, no, we're on the sidelines. We're not taking sides, but we can definitely watch this. And
I
like,
get
no,
that. I get that in half the church too now.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it's like, okay, so no, we can watch this from the sidelines, not take sides, but this is a great example for us to come together and make sense. And it's like, no, you're evil if you pay attention. I'm like, well, no, you're clueless if I'm evil.
If we're going to play that game.
You're going to play that game, you're a totalitarian problem. And that's the whole reason we need to pay attention to this. And like, no. And I got blown up, not like seriously, but almost. And it was tense. And then I started looking around and I got sucked into the Peterson phenomenon wake. Okay. And because my whole training and background is totally Jordan Peterson. My dad's father's name Peter. So I was like, hey, I can relate to that, And it's like, and so then all of a sudden I got sucked into the meta modern game B, John Vervaeke, Stoa, intellectual dark into deep web conversation. And so now you talk, this unified theory of knowledge or theory of knowledge society, talk society, is now one thread in this meta modern conversation. So now that I've synced up with John, I mean, John and I systems, as far as I can tell, John and I systems are hand in glove. I mean, I now have found in recursive, so I have this big system and I have a thing called Neurocognitive Functionalism. Okay, it's part of the big system. And it's a weak model of the nervous system as an information processing computational control system. Sorry to talk, jargon, but that's what it sits in there and it's a placeholder. So John's recursive relevance realization drops into that and just gives it a glorious, it's like boom, and then ties everything together. And that then fits like a key into the lock of the structure that I built. So now you have, and I think this is maybe the first time you have two meta-theoretical systems in the social sciences actually syncing up with essentially, as you can talk to John on his end, on my end, pretty much perfect harmony. I mean, these two systems now have synergistically unified themselves. And so he fills a particular system that I was missing, but my system goes around it in a particular way. And it's like, whoa, that's weird. And the people are like, because in the past you have these meta theorists with their meta theories and they all compete and there's no way to adjudicate them, but they all say separate. Well, now you actually have a fundamental deep synergy between two meta theories that are now creating an integrated pluralistic synthesis and then can become now other threads can get woven around that. And then you can really start to see an integrated pluralistic meta modern, intelligible structure of that affords then dialogos and the cultivation of a new sensibility.
What does it look like if you're right? What happens out there where the guy who drives the shuttle bus at the airport can see?
Well, I mean, over a period of time, and I don't know how fast and how long is a great question. How long do we have? How fast can this happen? Okay. But basically what you have is out there in the everyday lives is that we are raising our citizens and our children in a chaotic, fragmented pluralism.
That's true.
Okay. Whereby we don't know what love is and we don't know what wisdom is. And we have all of these knowledge systems, science into physicalism, undermining theism that then gets split. And now we get global exploration into like Taoism, not going to make any sense into Hinduism. And it's just overload. Okay. And there's no structure of understanding that affords coherence propositionally into your body. And then you had you are a primate. You can worry about evolution, but you're a primate and an animal and an organism. And then you live in nature and you're surrounded by technology. If we get this right, we will look back and realize, wow, we got the physical and biological right, but we sacrificed wisdom and undermined and cut the wisdom senses. And that left us soulless. Okay. And our spirits are not oriented. If we get this right, then all of a sudden it's the opportunity for coherent, integrated pluralism, where each individual can find the path to create vertical and horizontal integration, okay, where we actually feel known and valued with both autonomy and communion, and get rid of the game A competitive stuff that undermines and affords the realization we're surrounded in wealth. If we get along with each other and create a wisdom commons, we can actually have psychosocial, theological fulfillment in addition to our physical and biological control. And you can actually be like, oh my God, I'm so thankful to be on the planet at this juncture, as opposed to unbelievably nihilistically confused and be like, maybe I should kill myself.
One of the things that I found, boy, this is really interesting. Part of what convinced thousands of people in the Galilee who didn't really understand that Jesus of Nazareth was someone to pay attention to were miracles. Miracles are interesting things because we tend to think of them in sort of a modern conceptualization as violations of physical laws, let's say.
Yep.
Science fiction writers have made the observation, which I think is true, that in some ways technology appears to people as miraculous. I remember talking to a pastor in the Dominican Republic who told me that the first time his mother saw a train, she ran away screaming from it because she thought it was the devil, which is not an unreasonable thing to imagine, a steam engine to a person who has lived on a small island her entire life. So, you know, and if we were to tell someone that you can travel from New York to San Francisco in about 6 hours, tell that to a 49er, and they'd be like, that's of the devil.
Or having a conversation with somebody,
yeah,
in the same Zoom room while our physical bodies.
Absolutely. And so, you know, part of, you know, when we talk about systems, whether they be religious or scientific, for me, part of the justification, validation, verification is always has to sort of be both registers. It has to be true of mind and it has to be true of matter. Has to, you know, and it has to sort of keep both things in sync, which I think is part of, for me, what is compelling about, now obviously I take there, people do all kinds of evidentiary justifications of the resurrection of Jesus Christ, but even just as how it functions in the system, the resurrection of Jesus Christ works actually as a pretty good, this is what the culmination of an absolutizing of local truth would produce.
Yep.
And so you know, there are theoretical systems, but obviously as scientists, the validation of the theoretical system is always on the ground. And so it'll be interesting to see, you know, with your project and with a lot of John's projects, these, you know, how these things roll out. And for me, it gets into questions about order and chaos in the universe, because, you know, when Jordan Peterson sort of explodes in the little way he does, it was telling us something about the world. whether
Completely.
people thought he was the devil or an angel. It was telling us something about the world.
The Jordan Peterson phenomenon is
Yeah.
unbelievably interesting and actually quite large, really, around one person. I mean, it's an amazing
Yeah.
phenomenon, really.
It's very
really rapid and worldwide. I mean, he was a worldwide phenomenon.
Yeah.
In many ways.
And so it gets into, for me, questions of, okay, so I mean, one of the questions that I've had for John all along is usually scale, because a total system should, a theory of everything, let's say, should connect all of the layers. And obviously all of us walk around with a theory of everything, because I don't think you actually can live in the world. It might be coherent, it might be incoherent, it might be right, it might be wrong, but we all sort of walk around with a working theory of everything that we use, in fact, to map the world, to frame the world, all of these things. So it's, do you have, you've obviously believe in your theory of everything sufficiently to start to arrange your life around it.
Sure.
I mean, what is your thinking about that? Because again, like I said, we all have a theory of everything, because I don't think a human being can actually live without that. That's basically our operating system.
Yep.
And then the question is, how well does my theory of everything interface with yours? Is it sufficient? We can have a productive conversation, et cetera, et cetera.
Totally.
I mean, what you're thinking about that with respect to now what you have developed?
Well, that's a great and deep question. It's got many layers to it. Certainly, my life and the theory, as my wife and everyone who knows me well knows, those things are unbelievably intertwined, so that the enactment, the embodiment, the extension, if we do some 4E cognition from John's world and my world, frankly, into as I see the thing, the world transforms, and then it transforms me, and I'm transformed by it. Okay. And then it has grown, and I have been since I can put 1996 on the timeline and say Gregg before that, and then in the 1997, and then boom, and then there's a whole set of transformative timeline events. The scale is really interesting, and I have a sense of that, and we can talk more about that. But I want to also be clear that in some ways different than some of the other like Game B meta modern stuff, and maybe similar to John. But so I'm an academic, okay. And I'm trained then as a scientist, and I'm very much in that justificatory structure, okay? And what I actually get really focused on is actually an academic problem, okay? The problem is called the problem of psychology, all right? That's what I call it. And what it is a pretty simple problem that everyone should know about, okay? And it's the problem that nobody knows what the F psychology is. Okay. And that's really interesting, because if you know what physics actually is, the science of behavior and matter and energy across scale, and chemistry knows what it is, and biology knows what it is, and neuroscience knows what it is. And by know what it is, it has an ontology. Remember I said ontology and epistemology. It's got a clear ontology that everybody agrees on. And when we point to natural sciences and we say there's the hard sciences, we stop at neuroscience and drop on down, because they actually have an ontology, okay? I'm very sensitive to the distinction between ontology and epistemology, because actually, you know what science is in psychology? All epistemology. That is, what justifies scientific knowledge is the epistemological methods that you apply to then say, oh, I did an analysis, here's the analysis of my particular thing, and this is why I think it's right. But if you then say, well, what do you actually mean by behavior and mental processes ontologically? Meaning, what's the referent of behavior and mental process? Well, those are unbelievably complicated constructs. Who depends on who you ask. Whether you're a behaviorist, a psychoanalyst, a Rogerian, blah, 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 a cognitive scientist. Well, here's what my school of thought definition of behavior and mental process is, and this is where it exists in the universe. of possibility. And you say, okay, but all the other schools of thought say things differently. And it's like, yeah, thankfully, it's a very diverse discipline, and we really grow from our strength because we have all these different perspectives. And that's one potential truth. And another is we don't know what we're talking about at all. Okay, we're about as clear as our subject matter as a critic might say, theologians are about God. It's like, yeah, we actually don't know what we're talking about at this level from a critic vantage point. And I realized that. And I backed into actually a way to afford a scientific understanding of psychology's ontology. So that now I can say, I can solve the problem of psychology. Okay. And that's a big deal, because that's the Enlightenment. When I talked about the Enlightenment Gap, if we don't know what mind, body, and we don't know what science and social knowledge are, we cannot have a science of psychology.
Right.
It's like the epicenter of that. And it's like my system just at a problem analytic, boop, 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 boop. Oh, here it is. Okay, solve the problem. So it's not about, I am a therapist and I am deeply concerned about well-being, and I share John's meaning and mental health crisis at my soul. In fact, that's actually the whole therapy is like, how do we do this wisely? And then it's like, well, I should, because I'm an arrogant scientistic person. I was like, well, science should answer this. And I was like, oh my God, science can't answer this at all. And I was like, well, how might it? And then I figured out, and then it's a scientific humanistic philosophy that grows around it. And then it's like, well, so I don't know how to scale. But what I can tell you is the Enlightenment effed this up. The Enlightenment screwed us up, and its scientific reductionism screwed us up, and it got ontology and epistemology all confused. And we can actually get it right, so we can revitalize the human soul and spirit from a naturalistic angle, and then put it in right relationship with theological considerations.
Wow, that's big. Well, even just having someone, I mean, what you talk about, the problem of psychology, I mean, that's it. In some ways, over the last number of years, it's been increasingly exposed. In some ways, analogous to the way that religions were increasingly exposed by pluralism, and that the cultural pluralism began to increasingly suggest to us that we have a psychological pluralism problem, and that so I've made about halfway through the Jordan Peterson Clay Rutledge conversation. And so here you have two experimental psychologists talking about their tests, and you're making all of these scientific determinations based on college students and all these little tests you're running on college students because they're right there in the university. They sort of make kind of nice lab rats, but totally. We won't really call them lab rats. Right. Sometimes
they're weird. They're Western educated, exactly. Industrialized, etc. Yep.
And when you meet there's always this grasp for the universal. And that, one of the things I've been thinking about lately, and it's been the categorical. I was listening to Tom Holland's The Rest is History on dinosaurs. And whenever we say things like, we came from the Serengeti, I say, no, I came from Patterson. What is this we that connects me with the Serengeti?
Funny. Yeah. And
that, biologically, I'm contained in this skin. No, you're meaning you're abstracting this sack of things up into a relationship with hominids running around in Africa. And we're just going to wave our hand at that move. And I'm not saying the move is illegitimate. I'm just saying, you
need some specification.
When I was in calculus in college, they'd say, show your work.
Yeah, beautiful. Right, you're missing a couple of steps.
That's
here.
Right. What do you mean we? No, the dinosaurs are still with us. I haven't seen a T-Rex. No, it's that bird.
The birds.
The bird is a dinosaur. What's the relationship between the bird and the dinosaur?
That's right.
And so, wow. This has been, This has been very, very interesting.
Mm.
And I really, I'll just be frank with you that, so before I went to theological school, I got a degree in history. And so I've always tended to be sort of historically minded. That tends to be what I enjoy. The history of discovery, I'll say it that way, is a very interesting thing. Lots of people discover things that that things that change the world and things that don't. And at the time, it's really hard to know which is going to be which.
Yeah, no doubt.
and I always, because I love history, I always have a consciousness of that.
All right.
And I can apply that within my own religious tradition. A critical mass of first century Jerusalem authorities came to the communal decision, even across culture war, political, religious lines, that the best path moving forward was to strip, beat, and crucify Jesus of Nazareth, and that would solve a problem.
Right.
And of course, 300 years later, the world was a very different place.
Yeah, a slightly different perspective.
A slightly different perspective on what they did to this man.
Yes.
And so I always keep that in mind when I talk to people, because people will, I'm very high in openness. And so I don't like closing things quickly. That's part of the reason I have these conversations, because, I could be wrong. Could be wrong about whole ranges of things. In fact, I'm almost certain I'm wrong about whole ranges of things.
We're virtually all are. Right.
That's right.
For one thing we know, we're limited, and the universe is unbelievably vast.
That's right. And so, this has been we're over 2 hours now, so I think we should land the plane. And I have
I think so.
But
okay. Yeah, I got to roll too here. So, but
this has been very interesting. And so I want to think about this a little bit more, because obviously you've got a lot of stuff built into this, and I really like some of the ways that you sort of layered things out there. So let's think about what we might want to do with another conversation.
Sure, I'd really welcome that. No, it's a joy to hang with you, and I really like I said, I deeply appreciate the connection, basically, in this space. And I think if we can cultivate a sense of philia and philosophia and agape, and just in the brothership and fellowship of these moments, that that's what I feel with John. And I feel I haven't had as much contact with you, but I feel that through the airwaves and with a lot of people in this time. I think that's a very it's going to afford us something, hopefully.
Well, and part of the way I know that you're sincere is because it takes courage to do what you're doing. I mean, it really does.
Oh, yeah. It's been going on for a long time. So yeah,
but that courage is not a small thing.
No, there's a whole, there's obviously, right. We shift into therapeutic dynamics. I can get into my heart and wounds and craziness and narcissism and all that dynamic.
Sure,
but
sure.
it's been a journey, Paul.
No, that I believe. That I believe. Well, good. Well, this has been very interesting, and it's been very interesting. It took some turns I didn't expect. So right. I know that the audience will see it, because I know that it's going to be very interesting to see how my channel likes this video, because obviously it's going to be very interesting to see how my channel likes this video. And I know some people are, I always have this. When I first started talking to John, a lot of people were, oh, you shouldn't be talking to him. Shouldn't be talking to him. Don't talk to him. I'll talk to who I want to.
Yeah.
You can unsubscribe. That's okay. We don't all go on these journeys together. And but now it's
Right.
interesting because people who 3 years ago said, don't talk to John Vervaeke love John Vervaeke. And it's like, well, I don't know, maybe I've corrupted them.
Yeah. So I at sort of the spiritual level, I would definitely say, I don't want to overspeak for John, but John and I, from my vantage point, pretty much two peas in a pod when it comes to the spiritual world. So I haven't found hardly any, my hair's breadth of difference ultimately between where he and I land in the territory. So that's, so if folks are wondering about me, obviously there's a lot more to tell and a whole nother set of architectures that I bring to bear, unlike recursive relevance realization and awakening from the meaning narrative, but it's enormously synergistic and essentially in the exact same value, fact value territory of justification or whatever.
Interesting. Well, maybe the three of us would do an interesting conversation. That could be fun too.
Amen.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much.
Hey, I really thank you. I will put this up on my TOK21 channel as well after you drop it, and then we'll
send me the link to your. I might be subscribed, but I'm subscribed to like 600 YouTube channels, so it's hard to find. So send me the link to your channel, and I'll make sure I have it in the notes. I think this will probably come out probably early next week.
Wonderful. Hey, really enjoyed it.
All right. Thanks.
Rock on. Look forward to seeing you. Take care.